Welcome to the class on deep networks. This is part 5 of the lecture, and in this part 5 I will discuss the problem of overfitting. The problem of overfitting is well known. It's not specific to neural networks at all. Let me discuss it taking neural networks as an example. We have seen in the previous part that big multi-layer networks are flexible and can be trained by backprop to minimize classification error. The question then arises, is this type of flexibility always good? So let's go back to our standard examples. We want to classify cars against non-cars, and we want to achieve classification by constructing a separating surface that separates the positive examples from the negative ones. Now importantly, we have a training base, but the network has to perform well on future data. If I come with a new image, it might sit here and we have to predict whether it's a car or not a car. Let's look at this in the situation where we have quite a bit of data. So we have lots of data, let's put it in. And then we take our flexible, deep neural network and train on this database with backpropagation, gradient descent. We find a good minimum, and the separating surface looks like this. Now the question is this a good network? Remember, the network has to perform well on future data, on future images. Let's look at this image. Well, is this going to be a good classification? This image is surrounded by green crosses. It's surrounded by cars, yet the network predicts that it's not a car. It's inside of this separating surface. Or look at this image. Well, it will predict it's a car, but on the other hand, there are so many red circles in the neighborhood, it might just as well be a non-car. So this separating surface makes these long wiggles, but we don't know whether these big wiggles correspond to the truth or whether they are just noise. Flexibility of a deep network is not good for noisy data. This is a first example. Now let's look at a second example. Imagine we have a postal service center whose task is to sort incoming mail. And mail has a postal code, and so we have some pre-processing tool to center each digit, and then we put it into the classifier, and the classifier has to say whether it's 0, 1, or 2, or 3, or 9. Obviously, this postal service center has to work on future data, not just on the database that's around. Now, this is a famous example because there's a database called MNIST which contains about 60,000 images of different digits. 250 writers have several times written all the digits from 0 to 1. The images come as pixel patterns 28 times 28. And the task is to build a classifier that classifies these images and that will work well on future data. Here's a couple of examples. I ask you, is this a 0 or a 5 or a 6? This is part of the database. Is this a 4 or is this a 9? Again, this is part of the database. Or this one here. Is it a 5 or a 6? Is it a 5 or a 6? Is this a 4 or a 9? Well, all these columns here, all these images in this column are 9s. They have been labeled by the writers as 9s. All these have been labeled by 5s. What looks like a 6 for you might be a 5 for somebody else. This is what I mean by noisy data. The data is noisy. The labels are noisy. It's not there are pixels around that are a little bit noisy. No, the label itself is noisy. Training data is always noisy. And we want to predict for the future, but the future data will have a different noise. Therefore, the classifier has to extract the essence of the task. It should not fit the noise. And this is the problem of overfitting. We found that deep networks are flexible and can be trained by backprop to minimize classification error. But this flexibility is not good for noisy data. And real data is always noisy. You may run into overfitting. And therefore, we have to control overfitting by regularization. Overfitting would mean we fit the noise and not the essence of the data. Regularization methods are the topic of the next couple of parts. Before we return to the problem of overfitting and regularization in the context of classification, let us make a detour and discuss curve fitting. I would like to make this detour because in the context of curve fitting, you will have seen the problem of overfitting in some class in your life as a student. So, the real curve is this green line. It's a sine function. Data points are just noisy versions of this green line. We have a finite number of data points here, and we try to fit with a constant. Well, that's the fit. It's not very good. We try to fit with a linear function. Well, it's still not very good. We try to fit with a polynomial function of order 3, which means in total we have 4 parameters. Well, this looks not too bad. Well, so let's increase further. Let's take a function that has 10 parameters and that goes up to 9th order. Well, this looks really wiggly. All the data points, and there are 10 data points, are perfectly well fit. The red curves runs straight through the data points. Yet, the task is not to fit the data points. The task is to fit on future data. A future data point may lie here. Well, at this point, the two curves are very close. So the red prediction will be quite good. Now let's take the same new data point and look here. Well, this is a big distance. So this is not good. We don't have enough parameters here. Now let's take the same data point and look at that location, at this case over here. Well, there's quite a bit of difference. So we have 10 parameters. The network is flexible, but it's not fitting the green curve very well based on the 10 data points that we have in our database. We conclude that the number of parameters controls the flexibility of the network, and too much flexibility is not good if we have noisy data, as we do here. Let's summarize what we have seen so far by our first quiz. The claim is 20 data points can always be perfectly well fit by a polynomial with 20 parameters. If you agree, raise your hand. And yes, this is correct. The prediction for future data is best if the past data is perfectly fit. If you agree, raise your hand. No, this is wrong. A sine function on 0 and 2 pi can be well approximated by a polynomial with 10 parameters. If you believe that this is true, raise your hand now. And yes, this is true. So a sine function can indeed be well approximated with 10 parameters. And here is the example. Here I have many data points. I have not 10 data points, but now I have 100 data points. And in that case, the same function with 10 parameters fits the green curve quite nicely. So somehow the number of parameters must be adjusted to the number of data points. This example of curve fitting shows that the flexibility increases with the number of parameters. Flexibility is bad for noisy data, but flexibility is okay if you have a large amount of data. But for finite amount of data, we need to control flexibility. And the same problems of flexibility also arise in the case of classification. Again, flexibility is bad for noisy data. We have the danger of fitting the noise, which is called the danger of overfitting. We need to control the flexibility, and the methods of doing this are called regularization methods. Regularization methods are the topic of the next part.